The morning of September 14, 1985, dawned crisp and clear over Mount Rainier National Park, with the kind of brilliant blue sky that made experienced climbers like David Chen forget about caution. At 28, David had summited peaks across the Cascade Range, but Rainier remained his obsession, a 14,411-foot challenge that had claimed dozens of lives over the decades. His wife Sarah watched from their kitchen window in Tacoma as he loaded his gear into their red Toyota pickup, the same routine she'd witnessed countless times. Yet something felt different that morning. David's climbing partner, Marcus Riley, had cancelled the night before due to a family emergency, leaving David to make a decision that would haunt everyone who knew him. Despite Sarah's gentle protests and his own cardinal rule about solo climbing on Rainier, David's determination proved stronger than his wisdom. The weather forecast promised a perfect weekend, and he'd been planning this particular route, the challenging Disappointment Cleaver, for months. Before we continue with David's story, I'd like to ask you to subscribe to our channel if you haven't already, and please let us know in the comments where you're watching from around the world. Your support helps us bring these important stories to light. Sarah Chen stood at the window long after David's truck disappeared around the corner of their suburban Tacoma neighborhood. Married for 3 years, she'd grown accustomed to his weekend adventures. But Mount Rainier felt different. The mountain's reputation preceded it: sudden weather changes, hidden crevasses, and avalanches that could bury a climber in seconds. David had promised to check in via radio at predetermined times and return by Sunday evening. It was a promise he'd never broken. The drive to Paradise, Mount Rainier's primary climbing access point, took David less than 2 hours through the dense forests of Pierce County. The parking area buzzed with activity despite the early hour. Families preparing for day hikes, seasoned climbers organizing gear, and park rangers conducting their morning briefings. Ranger Janet Williams, a 15-year veteran of the Park Service, noticed David preparing alone and approached him with the concern that had kept her alive on the mountain for over a decade. "Solo climbing today?" she asked, checking her clipboard against the climbing permits. David's registration showed he was properly certified, his emergency contacts listed, and his planned route clearly marked. Still, something in Janet's experienced gut told her to pay attention to this particular climber. "My partner had to cancel last minute," David explained, adjusting the straps on his 70-pound pack. "I've done this route before, just never alone. Weather looks perfect, and I'll be extra cautious." Janet had heard similar words from climbers who never returned. Mount Rainier's beauty masked deadly realities: weather that could shift from perfect to life-threatening within minutes, glacier crevasses hidden by thin snow bridges, and altitude that could affect even experienced climbers unpredictably. She made a mental note of David's planned return time and route, information that would become crucial in the coming days. By 8 in the morning, David had begun his ascent through the old-growth forests that surrounded Mount Rainier's lower elevations. The trail to Camp Muir, his planned overnight stop, wound through meadows still dotted with late-summer wildflowers. The weight of his pack felt familiar and comforting. Sleeping bag, tent, stove, food for 3 days, climbing gear, and the camera that had documented dozens of his previous adventures. Photography had become David's secondary passion, a way to share the mountain's beauty with Sarah and their friends who preferred safer weekend activities. The temperature dropped steadily as David gained elevation, and by afternoon he had reached the snowline where the real climbing would begin. Camp Muir, situated at 10,188 feet, served as the staging area for summit attempts via the Disappointment Cleaver route. The stone shelter, built in 1921, had housed thousands of climbers over the decades, including many who, like David, were attempting solo ascents despite the inherent dangers. David's first night on the mountain passed uneventfully. His radio check-in from Camp Muir came through clearly to Sarah, who was monitoring from their home in Tacoma. His voice sounded strong and confident as he reported perfect conditions and his plan to begin the summit push at 2 a.m., hoping to reach the top by mid-morning and begin his descent before afternoon weather could develop. The climb from Camp Muir to the summit involved navigating the treacherous Disappointment Cleaver, a rocky ridge that provided the safest route up the mountain but remained fraught with objective dangers: falling rock, sudden weather changes, and the ever-present risk of altitude sickness. David had studied this route extensively, memorizing every landmark and hazard, but the mountain had its own plans for September 15, 1985. Around 3 a.m., as David was making steady progress up the cleaver in the darkness, he heard something that would change the trajectory of his climb forever. Through the pre-dawn stillness came the unmistakable sound of someone calling for help. A voice carried on the wind from somewhere off his planned route. David stopped, listening carefully, trying to determine if he was imagining the cries or if another climber was genuinely in distress. The voice came again, clearly human and clearly desperate, echoing from the direction of the Ingram Glacier, an area notorious for its crevasse fields and unstable ice formations. Every climbing manual warned against solo ventures into such terrain, but David's conscience wouldn't allow him to ignore someone who might be dying while he pursued his summit goal. He made the decision that would ultimately cost him his life. He left his planned route and headed toward the source of the distress calls. The terrain became increasingly treacherous as David moved away from the established climbing route. The Ingram Glacier presented a maze of crevasses hidden beneath thin snow bridges, ice formations that could collapse without warning, and slopes prone to avalanche. David's headlamp illuminated a frozen landscape that was both beautiful and terrifying, a wilderness where a single wrong step could prove fatal. The calls for help grew stronger as David approached their source, but the terrain forced him to move slowly and carefully, testing each step before committing his full weight. His ice axe and crampons bit into the frozen surface as he navigated around massive crevasses that disappeared into blue-black depths. The risk he was taking was enormous, but the thought of leaving another climber to die alone on the mountain drove him forward. David finally located the source of the distress calls around 5 a.m., just as the first hints of dawn began to lighten the eastern sky. A climber named Tom Bradley, attempting his own solo ascent via a different route, had fallen through a snow bridge and was trapped on a narrow ledge about 20 feet down in a crevasse. Tom was injured and hypothermic but alive, and his relief at seeing David's headlamp above him was palpable through his exhausted voice. The rescue attempt that followed demonstrated both David's skill as a climber and his character as a human being. Using his rope and ice tools, David managed to lower himself into the crevasse and secure Tom with climbing hardware. The injured climber had suffered a broken leg and possible internal injuries from his fall, making the extraction process complex and dangerous for both men. Working in the confined space of the crevasse, with walls of blue ice surrounding them and the constant threat of further collapse, David rigged a system of pulleys and anchors that would allow him to raise Tom to the surface. The process took over 2 hours, during which both men battled the effects of cold, altitude, and the physical demands of a technical rescue in one of the mountain's most dangerous areas. By 7:30 a.m., David had successfully extracted Tom from the crevasse and helped him to a relatively stable area on the glacier surface. However, Tom's injuries made it impossible for him to descend under his own power, and David found himself in an impossible situation. He could abandon the injured climber to seek help, a descent that might take hours and might be too late, or he could stay with Tom and hope that other climbing parties might come across them. David made the decision to stay with the injured climber, using his emergency bivouac gear to construct a shelter and his stove to melt snow for water and warmth. His radio calls for help went unanswered. The area where they were stranded lay in a dead zone where the mountain's bulk blocked transmission to the outside world. David's planned check-in time with Sarah came and went without contact, marking the beginning of what would become a desperate survival situation. The weather, which had been perfect during David's initial ascent, began to deteriorate as the morning progressed. Clouds moved in from the west, bringing wind and the threat of snow that would make rescue even more difficult. David used his knowledge of mountain weather patterns to prepare for what appeared to be an incoming storm, but his supplies were limited, and he was now responsible for 2 people instead of 1. Tom Bradley drifted in and out of consciousness throughout the day, his injuries and exposure taking their toll, despite David's best efforts to keep him warm and hydrated. David documented their situation with his camera, taking photographs that he hoped might someday help rescuers understand what had happened if neither man survived their ordeal. These images would later provide crucial evidence about David's final days on the mountain. By afternoon, it became clear that Tom was dying. His internal injuries were more severe than initially apparent, and without immediate medical attention, he had little chance of survival. David stayed with him, talking to keep him conscious and comfortable, sharing stories about their families and their love for the mountains that had brought them to this desperate situation. Tom Bradley died just after sunset on September 15th, leaving David alone on the mountain with a body he couldn't carry and injuries of his own that were becoming apparent. During the rescue attempt, David had strained his back and aggravated an old knee injury, making his own descent increasingly difficult. The storm that had been threatening all day finally arrived with full force, bringing snow and wind that reduced visibility to near zero. Trapped by weather and his own injuries, David made the decision to remain in the makeshift shelter he had constructed for Tom's care. His journal, discovered years later, recorded his rational assessment of the situation. He was injured, alone, off his planned route, and caught in a storm that made movement impossible. His best chance for survival lay in staying put and hoping that rescuers would eventually expand their search to include the area where he was stranded. The storm continued for 3 days, dumping several feet of new snow and creating avalanche conditions that made any rescue attempt impossible, even if David's location had been known. During this time, David rationed his limited food supplies, melted snow for water, and maintained detailed records of his situation in his journal. His writing reflected remarkable calm and clarity given the circumstances, focusing on practical survival concerns rather than dwelling on his deteriorating situation. Meanwhile, Sarah's world was collapsing in slow motion. David's failure to check in on schedule triggered the search protocols, but the same storm that was trapping David also grounded rescue helicopters and forced ground teams to wait for better conditions. Janet Williams coordinated the initial search efforts from Paradise, but the search area was necessarily focused on David's planned route, not the glacier terrain where he was actually stranded. The search for David began in earnest once the weather cleared, but it concentrated on the disappointment cleaver route he had planned to follow. Ground teams scoured the established climbing route, looking for any sign of the missing climber, while helicopters conducted aerial searches of the surrounding terrain. The search area was vast, and David's actual location lay well outside the zones where searchers expected to find traces of his passage. David's journal entries during this period revealed his growing realization that rescue was unlikely. He had moved far from his planned route, was trapped in an area where few climbers ventured, and had no way to signal his location to search aircraft. Yet his writing remained focused on practical concerns, managing his supplies, maintaining his shelter, and documenting his situation for whoever might eventually find his body. On September 20th, 5 days after Tom's death and 6 days after beginning his climb, David made his final journal entry. He wrote about his acceptance of his likely fate, his love for Sarah, and his hope that she would eventually find happiness without him. He used the last frames on his camera to document his location and the makeshift memorial he had created for Tom Bradley, hoping that these images might someday provide answers for both families. David Chen died sometime during his 7th day on the mountain, his body found 15 years later in the same shelter where he had spent his final week. The journal and photographs discovered with his remains told a story of heroism, sacrifice, and dignity in the face of impossible circumstances. His decision to risk his life for a stranger and his behavior during his own final days revealed the character that those who knew him had always recognized. The search for David continued for over a week in 1985, involving dozens of volunteers and every available resource from Mount Rainier's search and rescue operation. When the active search was finally called off, David joined the ranks of Mount Rainier's missing climbers, those who had vanished into the mountain's vast wilderness and whose fates remained unknown to their families and friends. Sarah's 15-year journey through uncertainty began with the official end of the search for her husband. Unlike widowhood, which allowed for grief and eventual healing, David's disappearance left her suspended between hope and despair. She couldn't mourn a husband who might still be alive, couldn't remarry without divorcing someone who might return, couldn't move forward without abandoning the possibility that David might somehow find his way home. The climbing community rallied around Sarah in the months following David's disappearance, but their support couldn't fill the void left by uncertainty. Marcus Riley, David's climbing partner who had cancelled at the last minute, struggled with survivor's guilt that would haunt him for years. If he had been there, he reasoned, David would never have attempted a solo rescue, and both men might have returned safely from the mountain. As months turned to years, Sarah was forced to rebuild her life around the absence of definitive answers. She kept David's belongings, maintained his side of their bed, and continued to hope for some resolution to the mystery of his disappearance. Well-meaning friends urged her to move on and accept reality, but they couldn't understand the unique torture of not knowing whether someone was dead or alive. The practical challenges of David's disappearance created additional stress for Sarah. Insurance companies required death certificates that didn't exist, leaving her in legal limbo regarding their shared assets and debts. David's employer showed compassion, but eventually needed to fill his position, ending his income and benefits at a time when Sarah needed them most. By 1990, 5 years after David's disappearance, Sarah had made some difficult decisions about her future. She couldn't divorce a husband who might not be dead, but she could begin dating, though explaining her situation to potential partners proved consistently awkward. She moved from their shared house in Tacoma to a smaller apartment, finally boxing up David's belongings, but unable to dispose of them entirely. David's photography equipment ended up in storage boxes in Sarah's apartment closet, too valuable to donate but too painful to use. His cameras, lenses, and developing equipment represented dreams interrupted and adventures that would never be completed. Sarah had never shared David's passion for photography, preferring to simply enjoy the beautiful prints he brought back from his mountain expeditions. In 1995, 10 years after David's disappearance, Sarah met Robert Martinez, a high school history teacher whose gentle nature helped her navigate the complex emotions of building a new relationship while still grieving someone else. Robert never tried to replace David or pretend that the missing climber hadn't profoundly shaped Sarah's life. Instead, he helped her find ways to honor her past while embracing future possibilities. Their relationship progressed slowly, built on honesty about the unique challenges Sarah faced. Robert understood that certain anniversaries would always be difficult, that September would forever mark the month when Sarah's first life had ended, and that any future they built together would acknowledge the ghost of Mount Rainier. When they married in 1998, Sarah kept Chen as her middle name, a compromise that felt both progressive and respectful. The newlyweds settled in Olympia, where Robert taught high school and Sarah worked as a medical office administrator. Their house included a spare bedroom that Sarah used as an office, and it was there that she finally unpacked David's photography equipment 13 years after his disappearance. The cameras had survived their long storage well, and Sarah found herself curious about the undeveloped film canisters that represented David's final photographs. Sarah's decision to develop those forgotten rolls stemmed from both nostalgia and Robert's encouragement to engage with her memories rather than simply storing them away. Since David's darkroom equipment had been sold years earlier, Sarah took the film to Olympia Camera Shop, where owner Frank Weber still processed film in an era when digital photography was becoming dominant. Frank Weber had been developing film for over 40 years and had seen thousands of rolls documenting family vacations, school events, and amateur photography. But the film Sarah brought intrigued him. The careful labeling on each canister, the professional-grade film stock, and Sarah's explanation of their emotional significance. He promised to handle the development personally, understanding the weight these images carried. When Sarah returned 3 days later to collect the developed photographs, Frank had organized them chronologically based on the film canister labels, creating a visual timeline of David's activities in the weeks before his disappearance. The early photographs showed familiar scenes, David with climbing partners at various Cascade peaks, wildlife shots from day hikes, and the stunning landscape photography that had been his passion. But the final roll of film, labeled Rainier Prep Sep 1985, made Sarah's hands tremble as she examined the contact sheet. These were David's last photographs, documenting his preparation for the climb that had cost him everything. Images of gear laid out in their garage, his loaded pack, and several shots of Mount Rainier taken from viewpoints around Pierce County as he scouted his route. The final photograph on the contact sheet appeared to be a mistake, a blurry, poorly composed image that David would normally have dismissed. Sarah almost overlooked it entirely, but something about the shapes in the photograph caught her attention. Despite its poor quality, she asked Frank to enlarge this particular image, sensing that it might be important. When Frank presented the enlarged photograph the following day, Sarah found herself staring at an image that would change everything she thought she knew about David's disappearance. The photograph, taken from high elevation on Mount Rainier, showed not just mountain landscape, but something that transformed the entire mystery. Evidence that David's final climb had taken a dramatically different turn than anyone had imagined. The enlarged image, though still blurry and difficult to interpret, clearly showed what appeared to be some kind of improvised shelter or structure, partially hidden among rocks, in an area that was well off David's planned climbing route. More significantly, the lighting and atmospheric conditions in the photograph suggested it had been taken during stormy weather, not the clear conditions that had been reported during David's planned climbing weekend. Sarah studied the photograph obsessively, trying to understand what David had encountered on the mountain that had led him so far from his intended route. The timestamp on the film processing confirmed the photograph had been taken with David's camera, using his film, but the location and weather conditions raised questions that defied easy explanation. Had David survived longer than anyone thought? Had he encountered something that had changed his plans entirely? Robert helped Sarah research the topographical features visible in the photograph, comparing them to detailed maps of Mount Rainier's various climbing routes. The location appeared to be somewhere in the vicinity of the Ingram Glacier, an area both remote and extremely dangerous, terrain that no solo climber would enter without compelling reasons. The structure in the photograph remained mysterious, appearing too deliberate to be natural rock formation, but too isolated to be any known installation. 15 years after David's disappearance, Sarah made the decision to contact the National Park Service with her discovery. Janet Williams had retired from active duty but still lived in the area and maintained connections with current park personnel. When Sarah called her, explaining about the discovered photograph, Janet's immediate response was excitement mixed with professional skepticism about what the image might reveal. The photograph generated immediate interest among park officials who had studied Mount Rainier's terrain for decades. The structure visible in the image didn't correspond to any known installations, research stations, or climbing shelters in that area of the mountain. More puzzling were the apparent weather conditions in the photograph, which didn't match any recorded storms during David's planned climbing window in September 1985. A new search was organized, focused specifically on the area visible in David's final photograph. Modern GPS technology and improved helicopter capabilities meant that the 2000 search could be more precise and comprehensive than the 1985 efforts. Search teams were directed to coordinates that topographical experts had calculated based on the landmarks visible in the mysterious photograph. The discovery that ended 15 years of uncertainty came on a clear morning in July 2000, when search and rescue climber Maria Santos spotted something reflecting sunlight from a narrow ledge in the target area. Rappelling down to investigate, she found the remains of an improvised emergency shelter, constructed from climbing gear and natural materials, and inside that shelter she found David Chen. David's body was remarkably well preserved by the cold, dry conditions at high altitude, and the evidence surrounding him told a story that was both heartbreaking and inspiring. He had clearly survived his initial predicament for several days, using his climbing expertise to construct shelter and survive in one of the mountain's most hostile environments. His journal, protected in a waterproof bag, documented his final week with remarkable clarity and courage. The journal revealed that David had deviated from his planned route after hearing distress calls from another climber. Following his moral compass, despite the enormous risks, he had attempted a rescue that led him into the dangerous glacier terrain, where his own survival became questionable. The journal documented his successful extraction of the injured climber, the man's subsequent death from his injuries, and David's own declining situation as weather and his own injuries trapped him on the mountain. David's final journal entries expressed no bitterness about his predicament, no anger at the mountain that had claimed him. Instead, he wrote about gratitude for the life he had lived, his love for Sarah, and his hope that she would eventually find peace and happiness. He had used his camera to document his location and situation, hoping that if his body was ever discovered, the photographs might provide answers about his final days. The camera found with David's remains contained the final photographs of his life, images of his makeshift shelter, the treacherous terrain that had trapped him, and a self-portrait showing a man facing death with remarkable dignity. These images, never intended for public viewing, became the final chapter in a story that had haunted Mount Rainier's climbing community for 15 years. The discovery of Tom Bradley's body near David's shelter confirmed the rescue attempt that had cost both men their lives. Tom had been reported missing from his own solo climb during the same time period, but search efforts had focused on his planned route rather than the glacier area where both men had died. The recovery of both bodies finally provided closure to two families who had endured 15 years of uncertainty. Sarah received news of David's discovery with emotions that were both relieved and heartbroken. The uncertainty that had defined half her adult life was finally resolved, but closure brought its own form of grief. The David she had wondered about for 15 years, the missing climber who might still be alive somewhere, was replaced by the David who had died alone on the mountain, whose final days had been documented in heartbreaking detail. The funeral held for David in Tacoma drew hundreds of people from the climbing community, Park Service, and search and rescue organizations. The story that emerged from his journal, of a man who risked everything to help a stranger, who faced death with courage and grace, who spent his final thoughts on others rather than himself, provided a measure of comfort to those who had loved him and searched for him. David's story changed how the climbing community and park officials approached mountain rescues. His journal demonstrated the importance of expanding search areas beyond planned routes, acknowledging that ethical climbers might deviate from their intentions to help others in distress. The emergency shelter he constructed using minimal materials became a case study in wilderness survival techniques. For Sarah, finally having David's body to bury meant she could complete the grieving process interrupted 15 years earlier. She established the David Chen Memorial Foundation with Robert's support, providing assistance to families of missing climbers and funding for improved search and rescue technology. The foundation's work ensured that David's death might prevent other families from enduring similar uncertainty. The forgotten photograph that revealed the truth about David's disappearance became a symbol of hope for families dealing with missing loved ones throughout the mountain regions of the Pacific Northwest. Sarah donated David's photography equipment to a local climbing organization, hoping that other adventurers might use it to document both the beauty and the challenges of the mountains that had defined his life. Mount Rainier continues to challenge climbers today, its beauty still masking the same dangers that claimed David and Tom 15 years earlier. David's story became part of the mountain's oral tradition, told by guides and experienced climbers to newcomers who might underestimate the peak's potential for sudden tragedy. The memorial plaque installed near his final resting place serves as a reminder of both the mountain's dangers and the human capacity for heroism in impossible circumstances. Today, climbers following the Disappointment Cleaver route pass near the area where David spent his final week, though few know the complete story that unfolded there. His legacy lives on in the foundation that bears his name, in the improved search and rescue protocols that his case inspired, and in the climbing community's continued commitment to helping others, even at great personal risk. The David Chen story illustrates the complex nature of heroism, how split-second decisions to help others can lead to tragedy, and how courage in the face of death can inspire others long after the hero is gone. His 15 years of silence on Mount Rainier ended not with answers to every question, but with a clear understanding of the character and values that defined his final days on Earth.